I think that darkness works really well in ghost stories. The sense that there might be something malevolent that exists. That when we have those nightmarish fears, that when we peer into that that dark cupboard in our bedroom, and for a moment our brain says, "Ooh, that's a good place for a story to be."
There are tales of rogues and whores, of stratagems and wars. There's a tale for every season of the year. There are tales of knights and queens, of drudgery and dreams. There's a tale for everybody here. There are stories galore, in volumes by the score, on every subject throughout history. It's all waiting in Pandora's library.
Welcome to Pandora's Library, the monthly pod where I interview authors who write about the stranger things in life. My name is Karen Hamilton-Vile. I am a paranormal murder mystery author of a series of books about Ada Baker, a medium who solves murders with the aid of the ghost she lives with. This month I'm interviewing debut author GR Pidgeon about his dark Gothic historical mystery, The Haunting of Hern Hall. Graham lives near the Ashdown Forest in Sussex with his wife and 3 children. He's head of English in a secondary school where he teaches and inspires the next generation of readers, and can often be found exploring ancient parish churches, climbing winding staircases, and reading time-worn scripts on gravestones in search of inspiration for his novels. Graham, welcome to the pod.
Hi, how you doing? Nice to be here.
I discovered you via a friend. You gave a talk about your books, and she thought you'd be a great fit for the show. So I'm very glad she did, as I thoroughly enjoyed the novel. It had me gripped from beginning to end. Can you give a description of what your book, The Haunting of Hern Hall, is all about, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a Gothic historical mystery. And when I try to pitch this book to people, it can be quite confusing. But if you bear with me, it's a historical Gothic mystery set in a medieval manor house on Ashdown Forest in East Sussex, and it's set just after the end of the First World War. And there's an aristocratic family, the Chiddingstone family, who have lost their eldest son in the war, and they're grief-stricken. And then one day, out of the mist, an army chaplain appears, or he claims to be an army chaplain anyway at the beginning, and he says that he served with their son, and actually he was beside their son when he died in the trenches, and their son actually sacrificed his life to save the life of the army chaplain. And as the son was dying, he sort of asked the chaplain to return to Sussex after the war and to bring something with him to give to the daughter of the house. And that unlocks the beginning of a series of investigations, and a mystery sort of pursues from there.
What are the main tropes of the novel?
I was really interested in the idea of the haunted house novel. It certainly does have supernatural elements within it. It's really about grief, the power of death and the power of love. I think that's very eminent all the way through the story. But there's certainly definitely a supernatural sort of spiritualist element to the story as well. So it's entertaining, it's a little bit frightening, but it's definitely a ghost story.
Are you happy to read us a short quote from the book?
Yeah, if it's okay with you, I was just going to read you a little excerpt from chapter 1, because it really sets the tone for the story. And in chapter 1, John, our army chaplain, is arriving at Hern Hall. And it's this big sort of isolated aristocratic manor, sort of high on Ashdown Forest. The mist is swirling around. He's just gone through the gates of the house, and he's just about to arrive at a lake. And as he gets to the edge of the lake, he peers down into it. So we'll just read that for us here. Rounding a bend in an overgrown driveway, I came to the edge of a silent lake, its waters perfectly smooth. Wraiths of white haze rolled over its dark surface, creating strange, writhing reflections. I paused, fascinated by the curious play of light and shadow. Far down in the murky depths, something stirred. Leaning out over the edge of the steep bank, I peered raptly into the water. A child's face stared up at mine, encircled with wisps of yellow hair. He lay among the pondweed, his tiny body wrapped in the tattered shreds of a funeral shroud. I shuddered, raising my hands to my eyes. The doctors had told me to expect imbalances, one of the consequences of shell shock, disturbances of the mind, strange visions. I looked again. Now only a gaunt, haggard man was reflected in the water, a face I barely recognized. My own. I was not the same man I had been before the war, where confidence and pride had once shone forth. No months of suffering, both physical and mental, had wrought a terrible change upon my features. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, deep lines scouring my face, though I was not yet 30. Noise erupted close by. The beating of wings recalled me to reality. A soot-coloured heron rose clumsily into the mist, emitting a guttural cry that warned I had encroached upon its territory. It fixed me contemptuously with its yellow eye, then glided silently away into the gloom. I shivered. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. The garden seemed deserted. Perhaps I was too late. Perhaps all who had once lived in Hern Hall were gone.
You've received over 460 reviews already since it was released in November 24, so averaging sort of 4.4, which is no mean feat because it can be extremely hard to get readers to leave reviews. I think most authors know that, even if they love the book. I found this great 5-star quote online, which I'll read. The Haunting of Hern Hall is where Wuthering Heights meets The Turn of the Screw, The Woman in Black, The Chamber of Secrets, and Blithe Spirit. A richly layered Gothic debut that nods knowingly to the classics while spinning something wholly original. If you've ever been captivated by a tale of creeping dread, spectral whispers, or love that defies the veils between worlds, then this novel will not disappoint. I think that's a great summary, because the tension steadily mounts as you move through the chapters until at the end you're gripping the pages so tight that you think it's hurt. So I had to politely shush my husband because he came home right just as I was reading the last chapter. I really didn't want to ruin the tension of the moment. But do you have any tips on getting readers to leave a review?
I mean, I've been quite active on social media, and I think when, especially on Facebook's worked really well for me, putting adverts out there with a book cover, etc. And people will just sort of say, "Oh, this looks really interesting," and I try to always engage with that and say, "Oh, hi, thanks for showing some interest. It'd be great if you could read it." And then often they'll write back and say, "Oh, yeah, I've just downloaded it." And I'll say, "Oh, that's fantastic. If you could leave a review, that would be really helpful." So for me, it was quite a big time investment, sort of constantly monitoring and tracking the social media aspect of it. But I think when people realize they're actually communicating with the writer, that's quite a good selling point in a way. So creating that personal relationship is helpful. And hopefully, again, once you sort of get reviews coming in, it starts to encourage more people to leave reviews as well.
Mm. Do you do a lot of in-person meetings as well?
I've been doing a lot of sort of book club meetings around Sussex and Kent and Surrey. I've done local events at the libraries in Surrey. That's been quite well attended. I do events in London through teaching organisations where I'm talking to other teachers about Gothic literature, and as part of that I talk about my book, and lots of English teachers will say, "Oh, I've just downloaded it right now." So yeah, it's quite, being an English teacher I guess has its advantages, and I know lots of people that like reading books, but also quite scary because English teachers read a lot of books and they're quite stern critics of other people's books. So it was quite nerve-wracking having colleagues of my own sort of reading my books, but they were generally very, very kind.
The book is set just after World War I, and one of the main protagonists, John Eliot, was a chaplain during World War I, where he faced many horrors, and he suffers from PTSD, sort of known as shell shock at the time. And you go into a lot of detail in the book about his flashbacks to the horrors of his experiences in the war. What was your inspiration for setting the book in this time period?
I teach a lot of war poetry at GCSE and A-level as well. So I think being interested in the war poets certainly opened that part of history for me imaginatively. Those war poets are often expressing the sort of the horror, the disgust at the things that they saw, the disgust at the way they were being treated by a military that increasingly began to sort of just throw bodies into the line. So I've always been interested in that particular time in history. I was, trying always to bring that part of history to life in a way that meant something to myself. I went for the idea of the army chaplain because I just thought that was a really interesting way into the story. Someone that went to war but didn't carry a gun. Someone who was there to try and support the men that he was alongside and to try and give them hope in a place that, from an outsider's perspective, you think, gosh, that must have been incredibly, incredibly difficult. So that sort of trying to imagine what that would have been like, that character of the chaplain, once I sort of hooked into that, the story really came alive in my imagination.
Did you have any relatives in World War One that you know of?
We have got a picture of a chap in a World War One uniform, though it's dim and distant past for our family. I think we're more confident on the Second World War, but I think there were relatives there. But no, I can't claim to sort of have a deep personal connection with that. Although obviously, as most families in Britain are, there will have been connections back there. But in the area where I live down here in Oxted in Surrey, and as you all know, anyway, every churchyard you go to, there is a grave to World War One soldiers. And I go to France quite a lot for my holidays, and we're always going past all of these huge memorials to go past the Tom when we're driving on our holiday. And every time I just think, gosh, it's there. It is a real place. These men really died in these places, and you can't forget that history. I suppose it's a history that can't be forgotten. Certainly not now. I mean, I think when they had the 100-year celebrations or remembrance, I suppose, in 2018, I went up to Victoria train station and I was going to a conference, and they had loads of young actors, sort of 18-year-old actors dressed in World War One outfits. And they were walking around Victoria Station with their bayonets and their hats, and they were completely silent, and they would just walk along and they'd stand there. And it was, everyone in the station had goosebumps. It was so powerful to see these young, men full of vitality, these young guys in 2018, just dressed in military outfits of the First World War. And I can remember just watching that and thinking, wow, that is so powerful. If my book can do anything, if I can bring any of that energy to my book, that's what I want to try and unlock.
I'd like to read a short excerpt, if I can, from page 168. Then my dream vision swirled like a shifting kaleidoscope. Now I saw the pockmarked wasteland of the trenches. Pools of sulphurous yellow filled the pitted and cratered earth. A thin walkway of planks led across the desolate hell. White crosses marked the remains of the fallen. A blasted tree stump leaned in crooked agony, neither alive nor dead. Black clouds hung heavy over the earth, lit with the flickering flash of far-off war. In the graves I saw the forgotten soldiers, buried where they fell, their eyes closed in bitter disgust. I had watched so many of them die, seen myself reflected in their final glimpse of the earth unto which they were born, the eyes that lost their light, turning to blind, cold clay, yet they seemed to watch me now. I love that description. Sort of really made me think of, did you ever read All Quiet on the Western Front at all?
I think I haven't read it. I think we watched, I remember at school watching a serialization of it, I think, but I haven't read it. But I have read a lot of World War One sort of novels, especially French novels, but I haven't read that one.
Oh, it's very good. It was so powerful. I had to stop reading at one point because of the descriptions, but yeah, it made me think of that. Do you have a particular love for the period? Did you make use of your school's history teachers to check your historical facts?
I mean, I didn't actually, but I did have a fantastic history teacher myself when I was at school. I was very lucky that I had the same history teacher from year 7 all the way until year 13. He taught me for 7 years, and he was a Cambridge graduate, and for whatever reason, he ended up coming down to teach at my comprehensive, where I went to in Uckfield in East Sussex, and he was incredibly inspirational. He was incredibly knowledgeable, and through him, I really was pushed to really see history as an important subject. And I used to just go into those lessons and soak up all of this knowledge that he was imparting. He'd teach the curriculum, but he'd go far beyond that. He just knew so many things. He would just throw ideas out there. So I've always had a massive respect for history. And I think as an English teacher and as a writer, you're always working with history, because every text has a historical setting or a historical context that is useful to explore. So as much as I'm a literature sort of buff, I love literature, I'm also, someone that really enjoys history. I read a lot of history books. I watch a lot of history documentaries on television. But I think, again, that Edwardian period, that sort of 1910s going into that war, quite like Ian Forster and all those sort of novels, that wonderful sense of the class system. And then the war just kind of explodes it all. And then it all kind of settled back into that, into that Downton Abbey, all that sort of idea. So I was sort of fascinated by how the aristocracy continued after the First World War, really until the Second World War, when it really did all get mixed up entirely. So, I think if that immediate post-war period must have been an interesting time to live, when there was so few young men left in the country and so many women who'd lost brothers and husbands and fiancés and mothers that lost sons and things. To me, imaginatively, that's a rich sort of seam to explore.
Spiritualism is a big element of the book, which was very popular with people at this time. Can you explain for listeners what this was and why you chose to include this as part of the story?
Yeah, I mean, from my research, Arthur Conan Doyle lived on Ashdown Forest at Crowborough during that period, and Arthur Conan Doyle, were the biggest writers in the world by that point, with his Sherlock Holmes stories, etc. So he was massively into spiritualism. So spiritualism, this idea that through a process of seances and using mediums, you can contact the spiritual world, that the departed souls, people that have died, they go to the astral plane, and there are ways to contact them. Again, that's something I've read about in books, and I've read lots of Victorian ghost stories about seances and mediums, and I always think they're quite effective. Having a seance is a great setup for a story, because something might happen or something might not happen. It works really well for a reader. I think there's a real sense of satisfaction, that sense of what's going to happen here. Rudyard Kipling, again, his house was down in East Sussex at Batements there. His son Jack was killed in the First World War, and Kipling was completely devastated. He's this really pro-patriotic character before the war, writing these wonderful poems about how England should go into this war and its noble conquest. And when his own son died, him and his wife were utterly broken, and they never found his body. And him and his wife would go to France, and they would travel round to these hospitals trying to pray that their son had just wandered off the battlefield, or maybe he'd lost his memory, or maybe he was hiding. So that idea of that grief, the power of that grief, I think is fascinating. So in my story, the aristocratic family, the Chiddingstone family, they're absolutely consumed by grief with the loss of Will Chiddingstone, Captain Will Chiddingstone. They can't move on with their lives. And when this army chaplain arrives and says, look, I serve with him, for them it's a way, perhaps it's a pathway back to Will, perhaps it's a pathway back to trying to understand what's happened to him. Because can you imagine having a healthy 20-year-old son who goes off and then never returns? I've got 3 children myself. They're younger than that, but I think I can't begin to imagine how terrible that would be, to lose those vibrant, healthy people, and what would replace it. So that's what my story was really trying to explore, was how did people move on, or how did they try to cope with the loss of so many young men. And I think that's what spiritualism really became this popular way, I think, of people who were desperate for some kind of connection back to those people that they'd lost. So in my book, I've got a medium called Madame Blanche, and she's come to Hern Hall, and she sort of claims that she has the power to make contact with the dead, and Lady Chiddingstone is really keen to use this medium to contact her 2 dead sons, well, one of her sons particularly. And of course, John, who's an army chaplain, is very, very suspicious of this. And there's some nice moments where the medium and the sort of chaplain are debating, I suppose, the morality of religion, the morality of spiritualism. Do either of them make promises that can be guaranteed, or both of them asking people to have faith in an idea? So that's an interesting combination for me.
a lot of mediums were sort of prosecuted, weren't they? I think not even
Mm.
just then, but up to World War II, because they thought that they might be upsetting people's morale, I suppose, and sort of leading them on, trying to con them to take money from them. As an English teacher, were there any books taught in schools or that you studied at school which inspired your writing of the novel?
I mean, I think if you've ever read The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, that sort of tone of novel really inspired me. I've taught that a number of times. I've gone to the theatre and I've watched it. I know there are film versions of it as well. But that idea of a very slow-paced build-up to quite a sort of frightening ending. In The Woman in Black, there's a young lawyer and he's sent to this tiny town on the coast of Britain, and there's this eel marsh house, this creepy old house that he has to go and stay in. And a woman in black keeps appearing in the village. And every time she appears, a child dies in the village. And it really builds up, and it's really, really slow, and it's wonderfully described. And Susan Hill does this incredible job of evoking the kind of M.R. James type atmosphere. And I think for me, that was the thought. I used to teach it and think, yeah, this is great. Like, 40 years later, can I try and do something else in that style? It was difficult. I mean, when I was sending this off to agents, first of all, they said, look, it's just so slow. It's nothing happening at the beginning of the story. And I said, well, that's the same as The Woman in Black. Have you read The Woman in Black? Nothing happens until chapter 5. Nothing really happens until chapter 10, which is the end of the story. But they said, well, readers need things to happen really quickly these days. No one's going to be interested in a slow build-up. So I know, Karen, as you've read the book, I had to introduce that prologue at the very beginning, with Lucy playing hide and seek in the attic of Hern Hall, really as a device to hook a publisher. And once I put that in there and sent that off, I immediately got a contract. So it was interesting. I always wonder if Susan Hill wrote The Woman in Black now and sent it off now, probably she'd be told it's too slow, it's too wordy, no one's going to read it, like that. Nothing happens until halfway through the book. But of course we all know it's a fantastic book. So but yeah, I was interested in that. I've also The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I love Wilkie Collins. I mean, I think he always has that emotional center to his books, and interesting kind of psychological characters and interesting female characters. So I was very pleased when a few reviewers had just said, oh, this kind of reminded me of Wilkie Collins. I was like, yes, that to me is a big compliment. That's something that I wasn't deliberately trying to evoke him, but it's certainly a big influence upon me. And quite a few other reviewers have said that they remind me of James Herbert. Now, I've only read James Herbert once. I think I read The Fog back when I was a teenager. But quite a few people are, oh, you should read more James Herbert because you really write like him. So I'll take that any day of the week. I mean, he's obviously a fantastic writer and a very successful writer. So that's something I shall certainly go and read more of.
And the myth about Theseus and the Minotaur is a strong inspiration for the story. Is this a favourite classic tale of yours?
Yeah, I think it is. I think I teach a lot of the Greek myths to my sort of year 7 and year 8 classes, my younger students. So we look at Theseus and the Minotaur and Icarus and those types of myths. And yeah, I like the idea of something living within a labyrinth that's sort of been built around this terrible monster. Theseus creeping his way through it, and sort of Ariadne giving him the string to get out. So I like those ideas of darkness with some horrendous, horrible, nightmarish thing in there, but equally the sort of bravery and the teamwork that you can use to overcome that. Yeah, it's interesting. When I sent the book off to one of my publishers, well, they're not my publisher, a publisher, there's the bit at the beginning when Lucy falls out of the window, and as she falls out of the window, her arms flap like Icarus. And they said, well, how would a 7-year-old know about Icarus? Like, she wouldn't make that reference. And I think, are you serious? You're telling me that the 7-year-olds don't know about Icarus? Like, everyone knows about Icarus. It's interesting, isn't it? Whenever you write something, there are always people that will say, no, a 7-year-old wouldn't know that. But if you go to most primary schools, most schools these days, children will study these Greek myths from quite a young age. And I always think it's good to make your texts intertextual, to have references to other texts within them. I think that enriches it, even if readers aren't aware of it. It's enriching them all the time.
I think that's probably one of the myths that most people do know, isn't it, Icarus?
That's what I think.
The story is set in December, just before the winter solstice, and weather is a big feature of the story, sort of cold, snow, thunderstorms, etc. So it's almost a character in itself. Why did you choose to set the novel in the depths of winter rather than, say, at the summer solstice? What's the symbolism?
Yeah, I think I was really trying to go for that sort of pagan idea of the longest night, the darkest hour, the darkest time of the year. I thought if you were trying to really contact the dead, if you were really trying to make a bridge between this world and the afterlife, then in my imagination, like the shortest day of the year or the longest night of the year would make sense, I think, for me. I think I'd just been teaching Tessa the D'Urbervilles, and Tessa the D'Urbervilles, if you remember at the end, she goes to Stonehenge and she lies on the altar at Stonehenge, and the police arrive to arrest her, to take her off to her death, and she says, "I am ready." And for Hardy, it was like that midsummer day. It was like, well, because that's the end of Tessa's story. She's the sacrifice. And I thought, well, yeah, okay, that's the summer solstice. So let's think about the winter solstice like that. For me, a time of emerging hope, emerging light, that when the wheel of the year turns back towards moving towards light. And again, I imagine that when the First World War ended, it must have felt as though the world had got as bad as it could get. Millions and millions of young men killed, and civilians killed, and families destroyed, and economies destroyed for 5 years. It must have felt quite hard, the idea of carrying on, of rebuilding. And I think that that moment in my mind feels quite bleak. It may not have been. I guess there were people that perhaps at the time that didn't experience it like that. But for my imagination, that's what I was trying to sort of find, I suppose, that moment of utter despair. But there is hope in my story. There is hope in the character arcs of some of those characters. And there was hope for society as well.
And what are the elements that you think make a good ghost story?
I think the idea of a dark power that exists underneath or alongside the positive power, I suppose. I think we live in this world where we can believe in hope, we can believe in optimism, we can believe in light, and we should, and we do. But that's always undercut, I think, by a darkness. And imaginatively, I think that darkness works really well in ghost stories. The sense that there might be something malevolent that exists. That when we have those nightmarish fears, that when we peer into that that dark cupboard in our bedroom, and for a moment our brain says, "Ooh, that's a good place for a story to be." I think that moment when even as adults, when we're rational, we sometimes think, "Ooh, yeah, that's a bit strange." So I think for me, the aftermath of the First World War, with all that grief, all that pain, that seemed like an obvious sort of moment of trauma, and that makes a good place for ghost stories. I think for that uncertain power that exists, we're conscious of, but we don't really want to acknowledge it.
Where is Hern Hall based on? Are you allowed to tell us that, or do readers need to find out for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. As part of my sort of social media that I do, I go around to sort of big mansions and I take photos of them and say, "Oh, is this Hern Hall? Let's have a look at it." Because some of the book groups that I've gone to, people are convinced they know where it is. I grew up near the Ashdown Forest, and I used to go for walks on the Ashdown Forest all the time as a teenager, walking the dog. There is a building there called Old Lodge. It's this huge kind of Hound of the Baskervilles type mansion, and it looks out over this dark valley of trees, and the mist often snakes its way down through this. I think it's privately owned now, but it was sort of built, a good couple of 100 years ago. And that, as a child, always fired my imagination. I had that sense of looking out from the windows at where I was standing, that sort of thing. The front of the book cover has has Wakehurst Place on it. This is Wakehurst Place, which is a National Trust property in Sussex. And again, I did visit that during the writing of Hern Hall, but my publishers didn't know that, and they just obviously put this on the front cover, which I thought was quite interesting because that is a medieval Elizabethan manor house, and it's right near the Ashdale Forest, so that works quite well. But really, it is a place of my imagination, but it's also a composite of a number of different places that I've visited. There's somewhere that in the Cotswolds, Snows Hill Manor that I went to, and again it's a National Trust house, but it's got it was owned by a Victorian collector, and he went all over the world collecting really strange things. Okay, and he's probably an eccentric character. So if you go into this house now, it's full of like original samurai outfits, and it's got loads of witchcraft things, like real genuine. It's got a witch's room, which is fascinating. There's a whole book there at some point for me. But in one of the rooms you go into, there's this huge 4-poster bed. And I was looking at this huge old 4-poster bed, and I could see in the side of the bed were these holes that were drilled. And I said to the guy, what are those? And he said, oh, those are for the corpse candles. And I said, what? And it's like one of those moments in my life when literally a light bulb went on. I said, corpse candles? He said, yeah, corpse candles. I said, what are corpse candles? And he said, well, in the old days, when someone died in this house, they would be put into this bed. This is an Elizabethan deathbed. So I said, this is gold dust. An Elizabethan deathbed? He's like, yes, every aristocratic house would have a deathbed. And when anyone in the house died, they would lay them in this bed, and they would light candles, corpse candles, which they would put in these holes around the bed, and as the soul emerged from that corpse at night, the family would sit around the individual, and that light would protect the departing soul from evil spirits. And I can just remember being in that room and thinking, my goodness, that's about the most exciting thing I've ever heard in my life. And as you've read the story, you'll know that kind of connects to aspects of my story. So, yeah, you've got a number of locations, places like Snows Hill Manor in the Cotswolds, the Old Lodge on the Ashdale Forest, Wakehurst Place. All of these different elements sort of work their way into Hern Hall.
Teaching can be one of the most rewarding professions. In my job, where I teach history, I live for that eureka moment where somebody understands something and then comes back with an insightful comment. For example, so I teach about medieval surgery, leeches, bloodletting for humours, lots of gross and strange things. So you can see their minds working it out. And then one of them will say, so in 500 years' time, people will look back at our medicine and think it's barbaric. And you're like, yes, that's it. They probably will. Maybe you won't even have to cut people open in the future. Who knows? But I love it when you see that moment. What moment of teaching English has stuck with you most from your 2 decades of teaching?
I think the privilege of reading a classic novel with a class over a period of about 6 weeks, half a term, and taking them from the first chapter all the way through to the end and reading the whole book with a class is probably about. There are moments when you get near the end of a great story and a class have been studying it, and you get after about week 4 or 5, they're coming in and you can see they genuinely are interested in what's going to happen next in that story. Texts like of Mice and Men, absolutely love reading that with a class. At the end of Mice and Men, George and Lenny, faced with a very difficult situation, students, when we read it, students will be crying in the class. They'll be like, oh my God, I cannot believe that's happened in a story. And you're like, well, this is a really powerful thing, isn't it? Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird. These are life-changing events, reading books like that with young people. For some of them, it's the first time in their lives that they've really understood that stories can be moral forces for good. And it's a great privilege to be able to be there with a class. And you can see some students, when if I'm reading out loud and I'll be really getting into a book, that they'll look at me and you can see it in their eyes. They're thinking, my gosh, this is a grown man and he's really into this book. And I'm like, yeah, this is really good stuff. And in their mind, perhaps a book has always been something that's a little bit like, so what? It's monotone. There's nothing in it. I don't get it. But if you can make a young 14-year-old boy think that the book you're reading is actually something that's really interesting and really meaningful, you've done something good with your life. I think that for me is a great privilege of, as you say, of being able to shape a young person's mind to the degree that they might look back and say, yeah, I did read one good book in school, actually. That, even if they don't remember me, if they just remember the book that they read for their GCSE English, I've done something good with my life.
I remember Frankenstein the most, I think, from my school books I had to read. That was always stuck with me, which is probably why I write about the things I do now, maybe. When I was at school in the 80s, it was sort of that period when they weren't focusing on teaching punctuation so much. So I went to a grammar school too, so you think it would have been quite good teaching. But I think I had one lesson that I can recall, and I've suffered from it ever since, I think, especially as a writer. And there does seem to be a trend these days for using little or no punctuation at all in books. And what are your own thoughts on the importance of people learning punctuation in the modern world? Do we need to learn it? Is because computers sort of can fill in the gaps for us that we get wrong, or should it still be a core skill?
I'm the same as you. I mean, I was educated in the 80s. I don't think no one told me what a noun or a verb or an adverb was. I was never introduced formally to any of the punctuation. I think when I went to university, my first essay, the professor was just like, what's this? This is just rubbish. Where are your footnotes? I said, footnote? No one's ever told me about footnotes. I mean, hopefully as you read my book, you saw that the book was well written. I do take an interest in punctuation. I mean, I think punctuation should make reading clear. And punctuation, if you're interested in writing, can make your writing better because it's allowing you a toolbox of methods to use. When I was writing The Haunting of Hern Hall, I was definitely using a lot of dashes. I really noticed that. And I think dashes work well, breaking up my long descriptive sentences. So I think, yes, computers could do all of that, but a computer can't be my brain. A computer can't be GR Pidgeon's writing style yet. Who knows what the future brings. But by being interested in what you're writing, by being interested in the way the reader is going to interpret your ideas, that's what I'm interested in. That's my personal wish, is that when you finish The Haunting of Hern Hall, and if you say, oh, that was really enjoyable, you're enjoying my ideas in that story. And punctuation is an important part, I think, of a writer's ability to communicate effectively with a reader. The amount of times I'll pick up a modern, commercial novel, even by some very famous writers, in the first 2 or 3 pages, there'll be glaring grammatical errors or punctuation errors, and it doesn't spoil the story for me, but maybe I feel a bit disappointed. Maybe I think, okay, fine. If that's the level that we're going to play at, I'll just read it. I'll read it for fun. But, to me, it's important we get it right.
Are you a fan of the Oxford comma?
I think the fact that the Oxford comma can clarify things, within a list. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. I know that some people sort of argue that
it really
it's
splits writers, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll agree with the Oxford comma. I have no issue with it at all. I mean, I think, as you say, if it's not there can be confusion. So if punctuation is designed to minimise confusion and to make meaning clearer, then I'll go with it. But ultimately,
I've seen an example where it was much clearer with it. So yeah, I think I'm sort of for it too, but I don't always put it in my writing. I do have an editor who has to go through all my work because I'm still not great at punctuation.
No, well, I think that's it. I've got, with editors, I think editors are brilliant, and editors often suggest things, won't they, to us as writers? And you don't always have to agree with everything. I fully respect my editors, but as an English teacher, sometimes with punctuation, they'll say, "Oh, do you really need this comma here?" And I'll think, "No, I do," because in my mind, as I was writing that sentence, I wanted that pause at that moment. So I think, yeah, I like to be interested in it. I know other writers that just say, well, I'll just accept whatever the editor says, I'll accept it. It's the editor's the editor, and that's their job. But I think the editor's job is to ask us, did you mean to do this? Or did you want this effect? And that's where we should evaluate them. We should consider that before we just agree to it.
So I like to have a bit of fun with the last few questions. If you were to become a ghost, which ancient home would you like to haunt? And how would you spend your days? Annoying the living or perhaps chilling out in the dusty library?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I went to Hampton Court Palace recently, and that was fascinating, just spending the day there with my wife and children. I think we went up in January because it was sort of half-price tickets, and it was much, much quieter than it is for the rest of the year. So I was thinking maybe I'd quite like to be Anne Boleyn's ghost. I mean, I know she was killed at the Tower of London, but wouldn't it be nice to haunt Henry VIII a bit? Because he wasn't very nice to a lot of his wives.
She's seen everywhere, isn't she? I think all over the place.
That's it. And I live really near Hever. Hever Castle is about 10 minutes away from here. So that's like where she grew up. And up into the Tower of London, you can see the spot where she was executed. And Hampton Court Palace was, she was there for a while. So I think, I'd like to be Anne Boleyn, and I would like to have haunted Henry VIII. It's a bit like Banquo when Macbeth is, at the feast, and Banquo comes back and just shakes his gory locks at Macbeth. Because I do feel like, Anne Boleyn sort of deserves to have a bit of comeback.
And have you had any paranormal experiences yourself? Do you have any good stories to share?
I've had some experiences in my life that were frightening in the sense of it being unexplained. And I grew up in a town called Uckfield, just south of the Ashdown Forest, and there's this big old sort of private estate that by the time we were there in the 1980s, this old house had been turned into a boarding school, but you could still kind of climb over the fence, and there was a big lake. It's open to the public now. It's called Lake Wood. And my friend and I think we were sort of doing our A-levels, and one summer's day, we just walked down to the lake, and we were playing around on some rocks which sort of overlook the lake, and they're quite high up. And we sort of thought it'd be fun to sort of push this old tree trunk into the water. We thought that'd be great. It'd make a big splash. Let's just do it. Let's just be a bit destructive. So we were trying to push this tree trunk into the lake, and it was still stuck by a root, and we were sort of pushing it and rocking it, and it wouldn't quite go in. And we got really sort of caught up in this moment of trying to do this thing. And suddenly I looked up, and across the lake on the other side of the water was this old lady, and she was hooded, and she was just staring at me. And something in her eye was quite unsettling. It was really strange because you didn't really ever see old ladies on their own in this place. It was quite wild, quite remote. I said to my friend, "Oh, look, someone's watching us. I think maybe we look a bit sort of loutish, doing this." He was like, "Oh, yeah. So we sort of walked off into the woods and sat down and forgot about this old lady. We just carried on talking about music or whatever. And about 10 minutes later, it was time to go back. So my friend stood up, and then he sat down again. And in that split second of him standing up and sitting down, he'd gone from being a healthy 17-year-old boy to being as white as a sheet of paper. I've never seen anyone look so frightened in my life. And he just said, "Stand up." And I said, "What?" He said, "Stand up." So I stood up, and looking through the branches of all the trees in this wood, the branches formed a kind of triangle, and at the other end of this triangle of space, about 50 yards away from me, was this old woman's face, just staring back at me. And in that moment, I was absolutely terrified. My heart leapt up into my mouth, my legs just turned to jelly, my body temperature must have dropped about 10 degrees, and I can't ever explain it. And we both just took off running, absolutely ran through these woods and got out to the road. And I was like, "Did you see that woman's face?" He's like, "I did. I saw she was staring at us through the trees." I remember we started laughing about it, and we sort of started to think, well, what was all that about? But it was one of those moments in my life that I don't understand who that woman was. I don't understand what power she had to know where we were when we'd gone off into the woods. All I know is that she didn't want us in those woods. She didn't want us near that water, and she made sure that we were scared. And I don't know if it was a ghost, but she certainly had a power in her that was something that I've never experienced anywhere else in my life. And I've jumped out of aeroplanes. I've done all kinds of things. I'm someone that quite likes being frightened, but that was definitely something that was very strange. And about a week later, I explained this to my dad, and he said, "Oh, where were you?" And I said, "Well, we're up on that big rock overlooking the lake." And he said, "Well, you know the story of that rock, don't you?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, back when the big country house was open, back in like the 1900s, the daughter of the house fell in love with the gardener. And her father, obviously, was a rich man. He wouldn't allow it. And so he sent the gardener away, sent the gardener packing. And this poor girl was so miserable that she threw herself off this rock into the lake and she drowned. She committed suicide there." And I was like, "Oh, that's weird." So when we were trying to push that tree trunk into the lake, maybe she was the spirit of that woman. She was trying to warn us, don't go near the edge, because if you fall in, you're going to die. So I don't know. So anyway, that was my sort of joined up thinking at the age of 17. But yeah, it was quite interesting. I mean, I do think that occasionally you experience things or you see things that go beyond rational fear and go far deeper. And that was one of those moments where I was genuinely frightened by seeing something my brain knew was not there. It wasn't real, although I could see it. And I think that's what you're trying to go for when you're writing stories, aren't you? You're trying to get to that point where it becomes almost believable that something isn't there, is there.
Did you draw on that when you were doing your writing, that experience, or?
I think so. I think it's sort of, there's a lake in my story. There's a sense of being out in the woods in lots of my stories. So, and again, it was quite unexpected. It was, we weren't looking to be frightened at that moment. We were healthy, like 18-year-olds. We weren't trying to make each other scared. It was just, we're both independently completely terrified by something we saw. So that sense, I think, of something just really disturbing you, I think has always stayed with me. And I think when we're writing, we're always drawing on things that we've read, places that we've been, emotions that we've had. And that for me, that woman's face, I can still tap into that. I can still see it in my imagination. Even as I was describing that story to you then, I could still see it looking at me. And
I could see it in your face. You were sort of in a different place. Yeah,
that's it. That's quite a powerful moment for me.
I often find when I'm selling directly to people that they tell me their ghost stories. Do you find that as well? Their true life stories? Does that happen to you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, lots of the book clubs that I go to, there'll be perhaps 20 people and they'll have read my book, and I'll go along and we'll talk about the book and the characters and things. And then actually, as the conversation goes on, you'll normally get a few people sitting around a table that will say, oh, actually, something similar happened to me, or your story reminded me of this, and this. And which is quite, I see that as a compliment in a way, that people begin to want to share their own experiences. I've met someone who said, "Oh, I really like the Madame Blanche character because my aunt was a medium," and then everyone was like, "Oh, we didn't tell us that," and then they started to tell us all about their aunt's experience of being a psychic and things. So I think more people than you expect have stories about the paranormal, or they have experiences that they want to kind of share because they've never really felt like they knew what to do with it or what to make of it. So yeah, I feel that. Writing sort of these Gothic historical stories, I enjoy them, but it brings me in touch with people who also enjoy that kind of story. And actually there's a kind of meeting of kindred spirits, and that's nice.
Absolutely, yeah. So you have a new novel released this October, The Shadow of Hern Hall. Can you give us a little teaser what it will be about?
Yeah, well, again, the title, we and my editor are just looking at the title at the moment. It might be the Woman in the Woods, because that's how the story begins, which again, that does link, doesn't it, to what I've just been telling you about. But
yeah.
So The Woman in the Woods, it's coming out on the 29th of October from Bloodhound Books. And again, I'm hoping for an audio book as well, because the audio book for Hern Hall has done really, really well on Audible. Read by Ralph Lister. That's done fantastically well. So it'd be great if we could do that again. But this story, so it's set in the same universe as The Haunting of Hern Hall, okay? But it's actually set 1 year before The Haunting of Hern Hall. But there are some crossover characters within it. Reverend Stretfield, if you remember Reverend Stretfield from The Haunting of Hern Hall, he makes an appearance in this one. And Hern Hall itself makes an appearance in the story. But the main set of characters are new, and there's a new sort of mystery for them to untangle. So it begins with a man who's just been released from prison. He's a conscientious objector, and he's been imprisoned throughout the duration of World War One, and he's been locked in a room doing hard labor because he didn't want to fight, and he's been punished for that. And he's lived under the threat of execution because a number of men were executed as traitors for refusing to fight. And so he's had this quite traumatic experience of war, even though he wasn't in the war, and he comes out into Sussex at the end of the war. He's just been released, so it's sort of it's just right early December 1918, and his brother did go to war. And was badly injured and has been placed in a convalescent home on the North Downs of Surrey, overlooking the Ashdown Forest. So the story begins with him our chap that's been our conscious objector, who's now travelling to try and find his brother in this convalescent home. So you've got one brother who's gone to war, one brother who didn't go to war, and yeah, it's definitely got some dark elements to it. It's got lots of I'm going more for the folk horror aspect of it this time. So there'll be some strange things going on in the woods.
Love a bit of folk horror. Excellent.
Yeah, that's it.
And where can listeners meet you in person this year? Are you attending any book events of any sort?
When the in October, which I know is a long way away, but when the book comes out, I've been invited by the Gothic department at Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm going up there to do a talk with them, and Blackwell's in Manchester is going to be hosting a launch event for me. So if anyone is up near Manchester around about the 29th of October, have a look for that. There's Dr. Emma Liggins and Angelica Michaelis. They're professors in the Gothic department. What a great thing to be in a Gothic department. I love that.
Yeah.
But I work with them quite a lot. We do talks about Gothic literature. We train English teachers on Gothic literature, and so they're inviting me up there again to do that. So that'll be good. That'll be really interesting, and hopefully there'll be lots of students who are interested in the Gothic there, but also other writers as well. And then in a couple of weeks' time, I'm at the Radnor Summer Fair, which is at Sundridge in Kent. Again, that's a ticketed event. Again, it's a charity raising event, but I'm there selling books. So that's at Radnor House, Sevenoaks School. But they've got an opportunity for anyone to come along and buy a copy of the book and for me to sign it there. So if you're around sort of Sevenoaks, Oxted area, come along. I think that's on 2 weeks on Saturdays. That's about the 20th of June, something like that.
And where can people find you online?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably I'm on Instagram as my best place to find me. I'm just trying to. I think I'm g.r.pidgeon/author. So that's on Instagram, and the same with Facebook as well. I've got an author page, g.r.pidgeon author on Facebook. I haven't quite got a website yet. I did buy the domain name about a year ago, but I've never actually created a GR Pidgeon website. But Instagram and Facebook are definitely the best places to find me.
Brilliant. And thanks very much, Graham, for coming on the show. And we'll see everybody next time on Pandora's Library. Bye.
Thanks.
There are stories galore in volumes by the score on every subject throughout history. It's all